In the month of January this year, we're talking about what's at the core of Crossroads. What are our core values? What are we striving and hoping to be? What are the rails that'll guide us as we move into the future? The core values at Crossroads are these 6 things: prayer, innovation, growth, mentorship, hospitality, and diversity. Today we're going to tackle 2, innovation and growth, kind of tie them together. Hopefully you can see a little bit on how there's some similarity there. And in order to do so, I thought about, well, how do we talk about this from a biblical perspective? And I thought, it'd be really interesting to think about this from the point of view that there's a problem, and a problem needs to be solved. And I thought about one of the biggest problems that Jesus faced was 5,000 hungry people. That's a problem that needs a creative solution. And so we're going to read today from Luke chapter 9, verses 10 through 17. I'd invite you, if you would, to stand with me as we read the word of the Lord today together. Starting again with verse 10 in Luke chapter 9. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds learned about it and followed him. He welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. Late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away so that they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here." He, Jesus that is, replied, "You give them something to eat." Thanks, Jesus. They answered, "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Unless we go and buy food for all of this crowd." About 5,000 men were there. But he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." The disciples did so, and everyone sat down. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, gave thanks, and broke them. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Oh, the story of the feeding of the 5,000. There are math problems here. There are math problems. You may have heard of some of the math problems before. It says there are about 5,000 men there. Is that just men? Were there women and children? How many to each of them? How many did that make that crowd actually turn out to be? There are other math problems. Breaking 5,000 men into groups of 50 doesn't make it less people to feed. I'm not real sure what the strategy is there. That's 100 groups of 50. That's still a lot of people to feed. There are more math problems here. How in the world are 5 loaves and 2 fish going to feed that many people? 5 loaves and 2 fish might not feed your family if you have more than 2 teenagers. More math problems here. How in the world do 5 loaves and 2 fish turn into 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over after 5,000 people ate? The math problems are astounding. I'm not going to solve these math problems for you today. We're going to categorize this as a miracle and thank God for his miracles. But there are math problems here. What we have is a situation that the disciples and Jesus didn't anticipate. They were heading out to a remote place to get away. They were going on a prayer retreat, and these people followed them. They weren't invited, but Jesus was so captivating that people came along to see what was happening. And when we got there, we find that Jesus welcomes them. He spoke about the kingdom of God. Interesting topic. Sounds like a sermon series that an evangelist was coming to town for the weekend to preach on. The people are captivated. And then it says, he healed those who needed healing. It sounds like everyone got served. What a moment, what a time. Imagine being part of the crowd that day. This seems better than Woodstock, if I'm honest. What a moment. But eventually the problems begin to compile. And the disciples seem to be the one who are noticing the problems. And they pull up next to Jesus and they say, hey man, send him home, get him out of here. It's getting to be dinner time. There aren't any Jimmy Johns in this town. There might be a Subway in a place this small, but no one likes Subway, right? How are we going to feed them? Who are we going to pay? We don't have any chefs here. There's no stove. There's not a Safeway or a Giant. What are we going to do? And Jesus says, well, feed them. We would love to, Jesus. The problem is we barely brought enough for us for the weekend. We got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus responds to this cynicism by just saying, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. This is an interesting moment in the story here. The disciples, based on every bit of our logic, our sense, our understanding, are correct. We have a problem. Jesus, on the other hand, seems unbothered. The problem does not seem to compute for him. His math works differently than our math. But after the disciples push back and Jesus tells them to sit them down, they say, okay, there's no more arguing. Would you give up the argument at this point? I would probably want Jesus, the leader of this gathering, to understand what he's asking of me and us. You are being crazy. This is not going to work. No matter how well you think this is going to happen, it's impossible. But they don't fight back. There's this moment, it seems, where they're stuck between knowing the realities of their situation and the possibilities of the miracles that they've seen Jesus produce. I'm not sure if they're convinced, but they go about doing what Jesus asks. And then we get this sort of like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Seinfeld episode with the yada, yada, yada. There's no details from here to the end. It's like yada, 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 there's 12 basketfuls left over. And all we have is Jesus praying and blessing the food. And out it goes and people are satisfied. A miracle, a problem solved by Jesus. In this story here in the Gospel of Luke, we have a story of growth that demands creativity. Creativity becomes effective not because it's creative. In fact, it sounds insane. But it becomes effective because God helps and God blesses. It is the work of God solely that solves this problem. And it seems to me that there's an invitation in the church as well to be willing to be creative when God speaks, to imagine beyond its capacity, its capability, to think that maybe we can do more than the books tell us we can, our logic tells us we can, solely because God is saying we can. And so back to the core values today of Crossroads, we're going to talk about innovation and growth, about scale and creativity, about how to get from here to there, and how God might help us to see beyond ourselves. Now, when we're talking about innovation, I'm not talking about becoming Google or Apple or something like that. Innovation actually, as a definition, simply means a new idea, method, or device. Innovation is a new idea, method, or device. And I want to show you, using that concept of a telephone, the difference between invention and innovation. You see, the original telephone was an invention. You could argue that the cell phone was an invention, but really it was an innovation, right? The iPhone is not really an invention at all. That's clearly innovation. It's taking ideas and things that we use and continually contextualizing for the world that we live in, making things better, more user-friendly, more compelling. This is innovation. And so what does innovation look like in the church over the years? Well, at one point or another, we moved from tents or living rooms to permanent structures. We started using books like the Bible, which, can you imagine living in the 4th century and going from hoping that some pages of scripture makes its way to your town to suddenly being able to put together 66 books, bind them together, and have that in one place? What an innovation that must have been, a game changer for churches. Print materials, tracts, Christian writings, printing presses. And it is no surprise, really, no coincidence that the Protestant Reformation happened at the very same time that Gutenberg created his printing press in the same country. This idea of God working with people, and not just the Catholic Church, took rise because they were able to print quickly and print in the local languages of people as well. Then there were speaker systems, right? Like at a certain point, a preacher could only talk to so many people. And then we put PA systems in churches and in arenas and gatherings. Billy Graham, who you may have heard preach, is not the best preacher in the history of the world. Billy Graham came along when PA systems and arenas were being built. There's something to utilizing what's happening in your moment to create scale and growth. And we also have used email and listservs and social media as ways to get the gospel, the story of the church out. Innovation has been a part of the church all the way through. Sometimes innovation isn't even about the church being that creative, but about people using the innovation of the world that they live in. And the Apostle Paul is a perfect example of this. I have a map here of the Roman Empire. And if you know anything about your ancient history, you probably immediately recognize that this is the Roman road system. And the Romans really built the concept of roads. This was a major breakthrough that the Roman Empire came up with. And Paul utilized this in order to become a missionary to the known world. There was no way in the generations before Rome that someone could have covered as much ground as quickly as they did, that Paul did, until this road system was created. Books and books and books have been written about Paul's efficacy because of the road system and him understanding and knowing that these major towns were connected to each other and that he could get from there to here or here to there very quickly. In fact, there's this moment in Romans that because we live so far from the ancient world that we may even miss kind of what Paul is saying, but I want to read it to you, even though there's towns you may never have heard of before, Romans 15:19-24, and just listen to the places and the ambition that Paul names in this text. He's starting to close out his book of Romans, and he's telling them what his plans are for the coming days, and this is what Paul says. By the power of signs and wonders through the power of the Spirit of God, so from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ has not been known, so that I will not be building on someone else's foundation. Rather, as it is written, those who were not told about him will see, and those who have not heard will understand. This is why I have often been hindered from coming to you. But now there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I have been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to go see you when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I have enjoyed your company for a while. Now, if we can cut back to a map of that area, this is what Paul is talking about here. In the bottom right-hand corner is Jerusalem, the epicenter of all that has happened to Jesus, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension. Paul is saying he has preached the gospel from there all the way around to Illyricum, which you can see is about like a modern-day Croatia, modern-day Bosnia, I believe, that area. That's a lot of territory. Greece, Turkey, this is a lot of land. And now he's saying to the Romans, I've pretty well hit every city between here and there. So now I want to make it to Spain. Spain is clearly at the end of what they know is the world. This is their whole world, this area. Paul is saying, I want to preach the gospel from Jerusalem all the way to Spain. And part of the underlying concept here is, listen, I can't make it to the African part, but surely you all can handle half the world if I get half the world, right? He wants the gospel preached in all places. Wants everyone to hear. And he's essentially saying, I will do everything I can to hit up every town between here and Spain. The northern half of the world that we know, I will get it. You guys get the southern half. We can do this. And it was really through the roads that this was possible. Paul uses Roman innovation for his own evangelistic purposes. He can imagine getting to these places because he knows that down in this bottom right-hand corner, there is continual road from there all the way to Spain. He doesn't have to trust boat and storm and the chaos of the water. He knows he can get there because he knows there are roads that will get him there. And he's utilized them before in his evangelistic journeys. He's using the innovation of the world he lives in for the sake of the gospel. And so you may wonder, well, how has Crossroads been innovative? Well, here are some ideas of what we've done. We have increased the video and audio quality of online services, and we've shifted from this being like 4 members. Well, it is, right? You may be on vacation and want to stay connected. You may be feeling sick and want to stay connected, right? That's great. But we've also come to understand this as the front door to the church. More and more people who come to church tell us that they watched for a few Sundays to make sure we weren't kooky before they stepped foot in the door for the first time. I understand that. I get that. And so we're utilizing that as a front door to the church, as an evangelistic leg, as a way to put ourselves out there so that people can feel somewhat comfortable before they take the risk of entering into the community of the church. And we want to make that production very, very well so that we show and demonstrate to people who are watching in our neighborhood, who are thinking they're looking for a church, that we are a church that is creative, is artistic, has it together, cares about details, and that our message of who Jesus is clear. We also have begun using a modern database system. Hopefully at some point you've received a text message instead of an email. Maybe? I much rather get text messages than emails. But we use this as a way to keep in contact. We keep our attendances, we manage finances, we have a detailed calendar for a multi-purpose building. We use this database for communication systems and for information sharing. We've updated our in-house technology using quality equipment, communications from the soundboard to the live stream room. We have digital signage that we're putting up around the building to communicate what's coming up and what's going on, and so much more. We've also become more creative in our social media as well, utilizing the tools of where people live in today's world. Maybe probably too much on social media, but people are there. That's where people are. And so we want to present the church in those places, and we put resources and energy and manpower into those places. We want to be where the people are. And so we are innovative and creative in trying to get there. The other core value of the day today that we want to talk about is growth. And the idea of growth can sometimes be controversial with people. But I want to point out to you that there are celebrations in the New Testament of growth. In fact, here are just a few stories where numbers that are impressive are mentioned. There's the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000 as well. After Pentecost, we're told about 3,000 were added to the number that day. Later on in that book, even after the 3,000, in that chapter of Acts 2, we're told the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Further on in Acts chapter 9, we're told living in fear, which is fascinating, living in fear of the Lord. They were encouraged by the Holy Spirit, and it increased in numbers. That was after the first martyr in the church. The number still increased. There is a sense that when people are coming to Jesus, when the numbers are growing, more and more people are becoming compelled, more and more people are coming to faith, that there is a story to be told about something happening there. That when people are coming to faith, the Spirit is alive and active, and it's worth reporting and exciting. Now, when I talk about and think about growth, I'll be honest with you, I recognize that cancer is a growth too. So it's important to remember that not all growth is good just because it's growth. There is growth that is good. Your child getting taller. There is growth that is bad. Your pants not fitting anymore. Right? There is good and bad growth. And so what does healthy growth look like? What does healthy growth look like? It seems to me that healthy growth looks like this. The presence of Jesus is alive in the church. So much so that when we worship, it's as if there's a foretaste of heaven in the worship. Healthy growth looks like people being baptized. Healthy growth looks like people finding freedom from addiction, sin, and loneliness. Healthy growth looks like attendees on Sunday morning move to serve and to join small groups, getting more involved, more invested. Healthy growth looks like a growth in people's lives, that you can see a development of prayer, of character and joy within them. Healthy growth looks like the church being so meaningful to us personally, we tell our neighbors and friends about what Jesus is doing here. Healthy growth looks like people with difficult church experiences finding a season of healing here. Healthy growth is not just about counting and making sure the numbers look big, but actually being able to identify people's lives moving and changing as they come. That's the kind of church that we want to be. That's the kind of growth that we want to invite people towards. And so, in conclusion to all this today, I want to tell you a story that I'm compelled by in the church years and years and years ago. 800 years ago, this church was built. This is the cathedral in Florence. This church was approved by the City Council of Florence to be built in the year 1294. 1294. There was one problem when they made the decision to build this church. It was kind of a big problem, actually. They didn't know how to build it. There was no other building like this in the entire world. In particular, that dome there on the top had never been tried before. And while they pitched it and they conceived of it and they could see it in their minds, they had no idea how to actually build it, and they couldn't find an architect or designer who did. What's even worse than that? I mean, that's a problem. But what's even worse than that is that they estimated it would take about 140 years to build this thing. 140 years. I don't know if you know anyone who's 140 years old. I don't. I certainly don't know any architects or builders that I expect will be alive 140 years from now. Right now we're talking like 175-year-old people, right? So they're pitching this vision to the city council, and the city council is approving something that they will never see the end of. They know when the first stone is laid to this building, that this building, this church, is not for them. They will never worship inside of it. They will never see how this is solved. They approve and decide in 1294 to build something that they will never see the end of, and they don't know how to actually do. Their approval assumes that somewhere in the next 140 years, some creative person will come along and solve the problem that they can't fix themselves. And if that isn't problem enough, as the 140 years begins to count down, the original architect dies just 8 years later. The foreman of the project dies in 1302. 8 years after this is approved. 8 years into 140 years. So then they struggle to find someone else who would want to take the job that actually doesn't have a technique to actually do what they want to do. Who is that person? And they don't even have like Yellow Pages or the internet or what's that place where you look for a worker online? I forget what it's called. Angie's List. Yeah, there's no Angie's List in Florence in the 14th century, right? And so the project begins to slow because no one will take charge. Finally, they find some people to start building the part that they know what to do, and what comes along? Well, of course, the Black Death in 1348. We've learned a little bit about how pandemics can slow things down. So they're 50 years into the project. They still don't know how they're going to finish it. They've been hit with the Black Death. They've been through a couple of foremen, and they keep carrying on, imagining that they're going to get this done. Until finally they find two different artistic folks who are engineers, and they begin to discuss how they could reject the Gothic buttressing of the time and build this dome without using wooden structures to hold it up. And the two of them begin pitching these concepts, and in the late 14th century, they come up with a plan, and it's approved, and they begin moving on working on this. Historians will now look at this moment and say, the decision of how to build this dome was one of a handful of things that led to the Renaissance. So we move from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance because people in the late Middle Ages made a call to build something that they couldn't figure out how it could possibly be done. The Renaissance is now on, and it's on in Florence, at least in part because of this building right here. Now these pictures, I hope you know this, but these pictures were not taken in the 1400s. These are pretty recent pictures, actually. And you can see that even with 500 years of advance, how much bigger this structure is than the rest of the town. They were committing to themselves to something that was beyond what the average person could possibly imagine. And they kept carrying on without knowing how it was going to conclude. Not sure that it was even possible that they could get to where they wanted, but they had a vision and a dream for beauty that extended beyond themselves and their own lives. And they finally figured out a plan, and in 1418, they started putting together this plan of how to put that dome together with those two architects. It was approved in 1294. It was 1418 where a realistic concept came along to finish the dome. Think about that. We're 120 some years in, and there's just a roofless structure in the middle of town. I imagine there are people who walked by and made fun of that dumb building. Who would possibly plan a building that they don't even know how to build? Imagine the gawking and the laughing. But in 1420, they began trying their plan, and they finally finished it in 1436. This building that you're looking at, the cathedral in Florence, was built from 1294 to 1436. How many people were born, lived, and died in Florence between the start and the end of this beautiful building? People from all over the world travel now to sit in this place, to worship in this place, to gawk at this place, to photograph this place. 500 years later, it remains significant, not only in the life of the church, but in all of Western culture. And it took people approving a concept 140 years in the future that they knew in saying yes, they would never reap the benefits of. They began working towards something that they didn't even know how to finish. They left the problems of tomorrow to tomorrow, but they took on the call and the vision for today. Sometimes being the people of God in a church means taking a risk. Sometimes it means pulling up your sleeves and doing the work that you will never see the completion of. Sometimes it's about imagining a future that isn't real yet. But trusting that if God speaks in God's call, God will help us get there. In so many ways, this is the story of the 5,000. The disciples are given a task that is impossible. It makes no sense. It doesn't add up. But Jesus speaks. And Jesus speaking is enough for them to risk. If Jesus doesn't act, they're going to look like idiots trying to hand out 2 fish and 5 loaves to 5,000 people. If Jesus doesn't ask, if Jesus doesn't do what he says he will do, they will look like morons and they will be laughed at. But they trust Jesus. So they begin walking from group to group, handing out what they have, hoping that it multiplies. And it does. When we talk about core values of innovation and growth at Crossroads, this is not about us getting creative. This is not about us doing something special. It's about us opening up the possibilities of something we can't see. Hoping for a future that's written by God and not by us. Trusting an imagination that's spirit-led and spirit-driven. And seeing that something spectacular can happen through us, even if it doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. But this only works when we're attuned to God, which is why we start with prayer as a core value. It takes knowing the heart of God and hearing the voice of God and trusting that while we may not be the one to see it to completion, we may not even know how we'll get from here to there, God speaks. So we're going to get to work trusting that God will fill in the gaps and do something incredible. This is the sort of church that I want to be a part of. This is the sort of church that I want Crossroads to be, one that's audacious and trusting and will use whatever it has, short of sin itself, to see that people come closer to Jesus Christ and to learn about his salvation. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about these core values. I hope and pray that you can find yourself with a vision like those in Florence, a vision like those of the disciples. It may not make sense, but when God speaks, we move. We're going to sing a final song today called Be Thou My Vision, a beautiful old hymn of the church. Whenever we're talking about where we're going or who we want to be, it takes God speaking first and the church to react. May this be the prayer of our hearts collectively at Crossroads. Would you stand with me as we sing this song?